let's talk about some of the absolutely insane shit that was happening in 40k for its first 2 editions. While Warhammer now makes a big deal about being grim and dark, I mean, just read the little blurb on literally anything with the 40k logo on it, this only really came into play with the 3rd edition of the tabletop. Before that, it was just a complete free-for-all of references and in-jokes. So let's have a chat about some of those, shall we? Before we get into the video, I do just want to quickly thank my channel members, Vort, Cersei, Victory Kaiser and Kraydog for supporting me, as well as ask you, if you haven't already, to like, subscribe and maybe leave a comment. It really does help smaller channels like mine more than you probably expect. Anyway, on with the video. Kicking things off with Big E, he has been pottering about in one form or another since the very earliest days of the setting. Though, as the concept of chaos itself had not been introduced as of the very start of Rogue Trader, it would come around a few months later as part of Realms of Chaos, he wasn't quite as important to the continued existence of humanity. He was still interred on the Golden Throne, which apparently he himself built, but again, as there was no Horus Heresy to injure him, he was only on the throne because he got old. And importantly, he was still conscious and able to give orders. He just looked a bit rough and couldn't really move all that well. The webway also doesn't appear to factor into any of this. I actually can't find a single reference to it at all, so it's possible it just didn't exist. Interestingly, the concept of the Astronomicon, and the sacrifices of psychers needed to sustain it, seems to have been around just as long as EMPS has. I don't know why, but that really feels like something that would come later. Another element that I would have assumed came later than it did was the Eye of Terror, though it was a lot more normal, for lack of a better term, and was essentially just a persistent warp storm before Chaos was introduced as a major threat. Planets within the Eye were presented as lawless due to lack of contact with the wider Imperium, but otherwise completely normal, and were often fought over by the Imperium, Orcs and other Xenos whenever the warp storms calmed enough to allow travel. The biggest change I stumbled across between the original imagining of Big E and the Imperium as a whole is that, during the Rogue Trader era, humanity still had a win condition. Unlike the current lore, where humanity had a chance to escape reliance on the warp 10,000 years ago, but lost and is now fighting a desperate war for survival that they are doomed to eventually lose, Rogue Trader mentioned that there was a possibility for humanity to evolve into a fully psychic race, thereby removing their reliance on EMPS and the Golden Throne. Although I suppose in 10th edition we have 2 loyalist Primarchs running around and Call doing whatever it is he's doing, so I guess we're back to a similarly hopeful tone again. Speaking of the Imperium and the rest of humanity, Space Marines themselves have changed a lot since their introduction 40 years ago. They seemed much closer to baseline humans, but pumped up with copious amounts of drugs and chemicals, though they did at least have the black carapace from day one, if not any of the other specialised organs. While we're on the subject, I also couldn't find anything suggesting their height is in any way different to normal humans, which is quite an odd image. First edition Marines also didn't have the nobility and monasticism that they have nowadays. They were basically knuckle-dragging brutes recruited almost entirely from the criminal populations of various hive worlds, and were a lot more superstitious and religious than many chapters are today. They also literally ate shit. We aren't going to get into that here. Just as there was no Horus Heresy, the Primarchs also just didn't exist until about 2nd edition. They were just talented commanders and generals from the ranks of the Space Marines that just so happens to be named things like Lyon L. Johnson. Leman Russ is also a crippled old man in Rogue Trader, which I do appreciate. As there was no Primarchs, there also wasn't any gene seed. Each chapter of Space Marines was biologically identical, and successors weren't really a thing either. In fact, the concept of the Space Marine Legions didn't even exist yet. There were only different chapters, though they did still have the 1,000 Marine limit per chapter. The Ultramarines were founded in M32 as part of the third founding, and took the number 13 from a disgraced and erased chapter, along with their indoctrination rituals. Just as a quick aside, while we're talking about the Blueberries, their chief librarian and astropath, also apparently astropaths weren't explicitly human navigators either, but that's besides the point, was a half Eldar who somehow survived the exterminatus of Badab as an infant. The Ultramarine X-Space Elf fandom was eating good 40 years ago. From the original 20 legions that we know today, the ones who seem to have been around since the first edition are Ultramarines, obviously, Blood Angels, Iron Hands, White Scars, Dark Angels, who were much more Native American inspired rather than being pretty much medieval European knights in space, and Space Wolves, who honestly don't seem to have changed in the slightest since they were first introduced. While the Imperial Fists don't seem to have existed yet, the Crimson Fists did, being the first chapter of Space Marines ever depicted in art, which is very cool. The Imperium itself has remained pretty similar over the years, with the Imperial Guard, Custodes and Mechanicus being mentioned as far back as the original Rogue Trader rulebook, though they obviously weren't as fleshed out as they are now. The Inquisition also existed, though the Ordo Malleus was the only Ordo, and the first named Inquisitor was called Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau. See what I mean about nerdy references and in-jokes? The biggest change to the Imperium that I managed to find was the fact that they weren't nearly as anti-AI or anti-Xenos as they are now. In fact, robots were an accepted fact of life in the Rogue Trader era Imperium, and the early AdMech were said to actively seek out Xenos technology. Part of the reason for this seems to be that the concept of a machine revolt just hadn't been thought up yet. The Age of Strife seems to have been caused by warp storms and the emergence of psychers, rather than the Men of Iron getting uppity. The Imperial Guard, for their part, made widespread use of abhumans, which were a much bigger part of early 40k than they are now. Beastmen and Ogryns have remained pretty much unchanged. Halflings just got a name change to become Ratlings, and the Votan were represented purely by Squats, who served as mercenaries for the Imperium, and they were much closer to just being fantasy dwarves in space than their modern interpretation. As the Horus Heresy and Chaos itself didn't exist yet, Chaos Marines were pretty much just renegades who had seceded from the Imperium, and the main conflict of the time was the Badab War, showcasing these absolutely hideous paint schemes. I love them all to bits, especially the Minotaurs. The Xenos factions in 1st edition were a lot different as well. The Necron and Tau weren't introduced until 3rd and 4th edition respectively. Dark Eldar didn't exist yet as a concept, and Genestealers were completely disconnected from the Tyranids. They also looked like this. As for the races that did exist, the Eldar were a lot more like just fantasy elves in space, being an ancient and well-respected race throughout the galaxy, and also just a lot more capable than they are in modern lore. They could also use bolt guns, which is kinda cool, and while Drukhari didn't exist in 1st edition, Harlequins did, as did Chaos Eldar after the introduction of the Realms of Chaos, which is actually really cool. The Orcs were, again, much more similar to their fantasy equivalent, and were surprisingly diplomatic and open to trade with the other races. I also couldn't find any reference to their whole power of belief thing that they've got going on in the modern day, which is quite sad. The Tyranid Hive fleets were around in pretty much the same form as they are now, but the race themselves were kind of just bog-standard aliens, rather than a parasitic, extragalactic, Armageddon-level threat. They also weren't a hive mind, with the various bioconstructs instead being slave races ruled over by the Hive Tyrant, which actually makes their name make much more sense than it does today. The biggest change for the Tyranids was the Zotes. a self-aware slave race created for both combat and diplomacy. Yes, diplomacy with the Tyranids, we were robbed, who made up the bulk of the Tyranid ground forces. I think the Tyranids were still just kind of hungry all the time though, I think that remained pretty consistent. As I mentioned earlier, the Genestealers still existed, and still had their cults and crossbreeding stuff going on, but had no connection to the Hive fleets or the Tyranids in general. I think that a key thing to remember when talking about the earliest days of 40k is that it really wasn't all too different than it is now, despite what some people moaning online will tell you. Sure, 1st and 2nd edition were a lot more obvious with their silliness and real-world references, and it was a lot clearer that 40k wasn't necessarily supposed to be taken seriously, but honestly that tone continued on through the more gritty and grimdark rebrand of 3rd, and still exists today, just under a few layers of marketing. 2nd edition, at the very least, is almost identical to the current day lore, just with less of it. The broad strokes of the setting are still pretty much the same. Heresy happened, Emp's dead, Imperium's still not the best place to live, etc, etc. There was just more room to fill in the blanks as a player, which is understandable, they hadn't had 40 years to flesh out the setting. And while I can see the appeal in a more mysterious setting, if they had kept it like that, and not fleshed out the setting at all in the past 4 decades, I think a lot of people, myself included, would be a bit disappointed. Anyway, that was a selection of some of the most fun lore tidbits that I found from the Rogue Trader era of 40k, and how the setting has changed, or remained the same, over the years and evolved to become what we all know and love today. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much, it really does mean a lot. Like, subscribe, all the rest, and I'll see you all in the next video.